Hello and welcome to this presentation on intercultural competence in a more general perspective. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to a book that I've written together with my colleague Magne Dybdahl. And the book is called Veien til interkulturell kompetanse. And in this book, we present some aspects of knowledge that can hopefully help build intercultural competence in the reader. And I'll start with our definition of intercultural competence in this book, which reads as follows. Intercultural competence can be defined as an individual's ability to communicate appropriately with people who have different mindsets and different communication style. And an important aspect of this idea of intercultural competence is the ability to change perspective, or the ability to de-center, that we are able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, so to speak. And I like to illustrate this with a brief story from the marketing literature. And according to this story, many years ago, an American pharmaceutical company wanted to market painkillers in a North African country. And since many people in this country were unable to read and write, the marketing section in this company decided to make a little illustration. And the point is supposed to be the following one. You have a headache, you take a painkiller, and you are relieved of the pain. However, there was one very important thing that these marketers had forgotten. Now you can stop the video for a second and you can think about this. Well, the thing that they had forgotten was, of course, that in North African countries, people speak Arabic. And even those who can't read and write know that people start reading from the right to the left. So the message was the opposite of what the marketers wanted to convey. So this is a nice little illustration that it's sometimes very important that we are able to change our perspective when communicating and interacting with people. So, in order to build this intercultural competence, we believe it is important to consider some of these points here, or actually all of these points here. So, in this presentation, I'm going to go through these consecutively, starting with ethnocentrism, then going on to stereotyping, culture and cultural background, verbal differences, non-verbal differences, values, culture shock or acculturative stress, communication in context, and finally, loss of face. Now, before I go on, I would like to give you another little illustration. And this is from my own life, something I experienced many, many years ago before I started learning about intercultural communication and intercultural competence. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, my wife and I rented out a house in our hometown in Halden. And at one point, there was an elderly woman living there, a Norwegian woman from Oslo, ethnic Norwegian. And she and I got along very well. We had many nice conversations and had no problems interacting whatsoever. But one day I went to this house in the spring to make the garden look nice for the summer. So I brought some tools, and then one of the things I was going to do was to trim one of the bushes. As I was standing there trimming one of these bushes, the woman came out on the veranda and we started having a little conversation, a little small talk, talking about all kinds of things. And then she said, as we were standing there, she said, "You know, by the way, Henrik," she said to me, "you don't have to trim that bush. You can just take out the dry twigs, and in June this bush will look wonderful." And I was standing there in my semi-academic world, thinking about something else. So I continued trimming the bush. After all, it was my bush, my garden, my business. And then after a while, I had to leave for a meeting. And when I came back 2 hours later, she was gone. But in the evening, she left a message on my answering machine saying, "Henrik, do you want me to move out now? Do you want me to leave the house?" And I can honestly tell you, I didn't understand anything. So I had to call her up and talk to her about this, what she was thinking of now. And now, many years later, after having studied intercultural communication, I understand quite well what was going on. Now you can try to think for yourself, because what actually happened is something that frequently takes place in intercultural communication. And this is what I'm going to try to show you in this presentation. So we'll start with ethnocentrism, because that's the most important thing as a starting point. Now, ethnocentrism comes from Latin and consists of the two words ethnos, which means people, and centrum, which of course means center. So one definition of this term is that it has to do with putting your own perspective at the center when evaluating the world around you. And this is of course natural. When I go out and look at the world, look at people, look at how people interact and communicate, I have to look at the world through my own eyes and in my own perspectives. In my own perspective. That's unavoidable. However, the problem comes in when I start making judgments on the basis of my own culture. If I look at people and I think, "Oh, that's stupid," or "that's nice," or "that's good," then very often I make these judgments because of what I'm used to from my own background. And this is sometimes problematic. And this, of course, again, relates to the ability to decenter. Now, we are not saying that extreme cultural relativity should be the goal. We're not saying that any cultural practice or any cultural behavior is acceptable. There have been cultures through time who have sacrificed people to the gods. That's not acceptable. Or you can have forced marriages or genital mutilation. I think that's very problematic. So that's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that the idea is to try to view other people's thinking and behavior with an open mind and as objectively as possible before judging them. And this is what this decentering, changing perspective means. So we have to start with ourselves. And when we have done that, and when we are aware of our own ethnocentrism, we can start talking about stereotyping and the problems of stereotyping. And as you know, a stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. Now, stereotypes can be true to some extent, but sometimes they're not. So we have to be very careful when we generalize, saying that all Japanese, they communicate indirectly, or all French are great lovers, or all Germans are hardworking, or whatever we say. Now, thirdly, we have to be aware of prejudice. And as you know, prejudice is even worse than stereotyping because it has to do with negative perceptions and preconceived negative opinions based on not based on reason or actual experience. Okay, and having those things in mind, we can go on to talk about culture. And in the other lecture which I've posted in Canvas, I have already given you a definition from Bait and Plug, say that culture is a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that the members of a society use to cope with their world and with another, and that is transmitted from generation to generation through learning. A very nice definition. But again, there are so many different definitions out there, so defining culture is very problematic. But in this presentation now, we need to have something to go by, so we need to have a starting point for discussing what culture is or what culture can be. Now, another definition I'd like to present to you is from Gerd Hofstede and his colleagues. And they say that culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes members of one category of people from another. Again, this is an interesting definition, but we need to be a bit skeptical, a bit critical here. So to say that the mind is like a computer can be problematic, because as we know, cultures, they change. But what we like about this definition is that it focuses on the mind and how our thinking influences the way we behave and the way we communicate. So, and as you also know, cultures can be on different levels, or we can talk about different types of cultures. We can talk about national culture, we can talk about youth culture, we can talk about regional culture, academic culture, many types of cultures. If we take national culture, we can talk about different ingredients, such as history, religion, values, social organizations, language, and many other things. And these are ingredients or aspects that influence the way people think, generally. So let's have a look at the United States of America. In the top left corner here, you can see a painting of a very, very important event in American history. This is General George Washington, the first American president, in the war against the British in the 1770s, when the Americans gained their independence. This was a very significant event in the history of the United States, and this has affected the way many Americans think about freedom, about self-governance, and so on. Or you can take, in Norway, Norwegians are very concerned about, their history, about the constitution, about the 17th of May, such things, which means that history affects us. Secondly, we talked about religion is important. In America, you can see the dollar with "In God We Trust." And religion is seen as important in America, also for affecting, for example, the Protestant work ethic, which is said to be very important for the way many Americans think about work, that the Protestant ethic of working hard and worshipping God, this has affected many Americans, according to historians and sociologists. Values are important. Social organizations, we talked about liberty, freedom, the Statue of Liberty. We talk about social institutions, Congress. We talk about capitalism, Coca-Cola. Many such things influence the way many Americans think about the world. But again, we have to be critical, and as some of you have already noticed, I'm generalizing now. There are 320 million Americans, so we have to be careful not to overgeneralize. But most intercultural experts would agree that these aspects have affected the way many Americans think about the world. Now, we all recognize that culture is important, but of course culture is not everything. Everybody has something in common, regardless of where we come from. Our human nature is the same whether we're from Japan, the United States, Nigeria, or Norway. We all have these human needs. We need food, we need drink, we need shelter, we need clothes, we need affection. All these things are universal. But then there is this layer in the middle here, culture, which also affects the way we think and act. And finally, of course, we are all unique individuals. So we are all different in some ways. So even if I'm Norwegian, I'm an academic, I'm from Østfold, I have my unique personality, and so do you. But going back to Hofstede, he talks about the programming of the mind, which again draws our attention to the importance of thinking. And this is where this idea of the cultural iceberg as an illustration is very useful for helping us define some important aspects of the mind and how we think and how this affects interaction. For example, if we go to a foreign culture, we can observe people around us. We can have a look. We can observe what they're eating. We can listen to what they say, their language. We can observe their customs, the way they dress, and so on and so forth. But what we cannot access that easily is the way that people think. Their perceptions, their beliefs, their norms, their attitudes, their values. And then it's very easy to misjudge situations. We think that people are very similar to us, and we think that they have the same perceptions, beliefs, norms, and attitudes, which they may not have. Or similarly, they may look very different, but they may have very similar ways of thinking. So this is something that tells us that we need to be careful. We need to be humble when we're out there and we look at the world and we think we understand what's going on. But again, as I've said previously, cultures change. Cultures are not static, they are dynamic. And just as an illustration, this is New York, Broadway from 1798. This is Broadway from 2010 something. So just as places change, cultures change, and we have to keep this in mind. Now let's go on to talk about verbal communication, because verbal communication is sometimes very different in different cultures. And there has been done some research into this to see how people communicate in different parts of the world and in different cultures. And generally, what some research shows is that culture can be described as a scale from linear communication to circular communication. And these are the Norwegian terms, but hopefully you understand Norwegian. And then I'll explain it to you. Research shows that in North America and Northern Europe, there is a strong tendency for people to communicate in a linear way. People start with point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, or if you're going to write an essay, you have to have an introduction, and then you have to have a problem statement, and you have a theory, and you have discussion, and then you have an ending. So it's very sort of linear and point by point. If you go to other parts of the world, there is research showing that in Southern Europe, parts of Africa, for example, the Middle East, people have a tendency to make small digressions, as I would say. Now, I am from Norway, and regardless of where I'm from, I have a fairly linear way of communicating. If you look at the PowerPoint program made in the United States, a very linear country, and me as a very linear person, I'm going by 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. But in cultures who have this sort of loop way of communicating, people may start talking about something, and then they can make a digression, as I would call it, then start talking about something else. And then they go back to the main point, and they continue with the same point, and then they talk about something else. And then they get back to the main point again, and then talk about something else. Now, before I started teaching intercultural communication, I was teaching some international students writing. And at one point in time, I had some students from Ghana in Africa, and they had this way of writing, and I didn't understand this. So I thought that they were they were not very diligent, not very talented students. So I thought, well, they can't cope with this, because they were writing about something and suddenly they were writing about something else. And then they went back to the main point and suddenly they were writing about something else. So I had to write them. I was giving comment in the margin. I was saying, stick to the point, stick to the point, stick to the point. Because of course, in Norway, in university, you have to stick to this model when you're writing essays. Now, in yet other parts of the world, for example, parts of Africa, there is research showing that people really take their time to get to the point. They may start talking about something and it really takes time to get to the point. Now, my colleague Magne Djupedal was once called by a Norwegian lawyer who was defending a man from Africa in court. And when the judge asked him to make a statement, to explain, he started talking, and then it really took some time before he got to the point. So when he got to, well, around this point, the judge would say, no, stop, you have to start again, you have to get to the point, you have to get to the point. So he was always stopped when he was trying to get to the point. And the lawyer called my colleague because he knew that my colleague had knowledge of intercultural communication. He said, is there some way we can explain this to the judge, that there is a cultural difference here? And Magne could tell him that yes, he is probably using the spiral model when communicating. So it really takes a lot of time for him to get to the point. And this is also something we need to keep in mind, that in a linear model, you're supposed to get to the point quickly. In other parts of the world, in other cultures, people are expected to take their time. For example, not to offend people. And then yet again, in other parts of the world, for example, in Southeast Asia, people, to put it bluntly or ironically, never get to the point. People are supposed to be communicating in an indirect way. You're just hinting. You don't want to say directly what is the problem, because that is sometimes regarded as rude. Now, this is not an attempt in this presentation. This is not an attempt to say that in Norway everyone is linear, or in Africa everyone is using the spiral model, in Asia everything is like this. The point is to show these differences, because when you go international, you will meet these differences. And you can even meet them with ethnic Norwegians. My grandfather, he came from northern Sogn og Fjordane. He came from Nordfjord, Hornindal. He was born in 1915, and he had this way of telling stories. So when my wife first met him, she was wondering, what's wrong with this man? He always makes so many digressions. But he just had this way of communicating. So it's important to be aware of this in order to understand people better. Another way of understanding verbal communication is to see communication as going from formal to informal on a scale. In some cultures, people will be very formal, using titles, using the third person personal pronoun. In Norway, we used to have the form die when we wanted to be polite. In German, you have Sie. In French, you have vous when you want to be polite. In other cultures, people can be much more informal in their communication, and you can also see it in the dressmaking, more informal. This is something that we may be conscious of. Norway is sometimes said to be an informal country in terms of communication, verbal communication. So we may risk insulting people if we try to be too direct and too informal. Then let's go on to non-verbal differences. Now this is a photo from a paper shown to me, from the paper Aftenposten, shown to be by a good colleague who originally came from an Arab-speaking country, a lovely lady. She once came to me with this paper showing us from Aftenposten, where this is, you can read you can read the caption there. Konsul Hugo Fjell har samarbeidet godt med lokale myndigheter. Her er han på besøk hos major Arif Mohammed Abdul Aziz, sjef for kriminalpolitiet på Dubai lufthavn. My colleague came to me and she showed me this picture and she said to me, Henrik, isn't he being impolite? This Norwegian, isn't he being impolite? And I was sort of caught by surprise. And as I'm a bit indirect in my communication, I said, well, okay, I suppose he is. Unfortunately, I never got down to asking her why she thought that. And we may make some assumptions. Some people say, well, he's sitting flat on his bum. We can see this Arab man is sitting very straight up, very composed. Perhaps he's being impolite by the way he's sitting. I don't know. Something about his posture, perhaps. But that's not so important. The important thing is it shows how non-verbal communication can really offend people. So we need to keep this in mind. Of course, it's difficult, but sometimes we perhaps need to read up on intercultural non-verbal differences in different cultures if we're going to a certain culture. I don't know. Yeah, sorry about the spelling mistake. It should be forms of non-verbal communication, not froms. Again, sometimes I struggle. But yeah, you know, of course, about different forms of non-verbal communication. Gestures can be different. Facial expressions, body movements can be different from one culture to the next. Body contact. I had some British friends that they told me that they hardly ever touched. Some people, they touch a lot. Eye contact is different from different cultures. Some people really don't like to look other people in the eyes because that's seen as impolite. In other cultures, you will be seen as you're hiding something if you don't look people straight in the eyes. Smell can be a factor. Appearance and dress, as we've already touched upon. Use of voice, use of silence, distance and space, and time. Now, just as a little, this is a banal example, you know what this means? Yeah, to most of you it will mean okay. According to the literature and according to some students I had from Japan, it may mean money in Japan. And in some parts of the world it is in fact an insult, an insulting symbol. It means a part of the body with a hole. I'm not going to say anything more, but it may insult people, so don't go there if you don't want to insult people. Yeah, about space, it's interesting to see different cultures, how they relate to space. This is from a book on intercultural communication. Grav alvorlig nordmenn på buss, because Norwegians typically like more space. If you see other parts of the world, people will fill up the bus from the front. So people won't be sitting like this. They will start sitting here, they fill up there, and then they fill up here. So people like to be closer to each other, and this is, research has shown this. But in North America, Northern Europe, people like more space generally. This is an example of Lyndon B. Johnson, the former American president, who was said to use this technique to intimidate people, to frighten them. So he went into their face to talk to them. Okay, we'll leave distance and space. We'll talk more about time. Time is interesting. Time perceptions. And you may have experienced this already if you go to other parts of the world. Buses are not on time. Trains, they come and leave arbitrarily. You never know when the plane is leaving. And research shows that there are huge differences here. I'm not going to talk much about this. You can read more about it in the book if you're interested. But I will say something about monochronic and polychronic time. Now, the American anthropologist Edward T. Hall, he studied time perceptions in Navajo Native American cultures and compared them to white Protestant time perceptions in the 1930s. And he came up with this idea that cultures can be roughly divided into monochronic and polychronic cultures. Now we're sort of stereotyping a bit, but it's interesting to use this theory to understand how people perceive time. In monochronic cultures, mono means one, chronic means time. So according to Hall, monochronic means that people have a tendency to do one thing at a time. Whereas in polychronic cultures, people have the tendency to do more things at the same time. So Hall says, he gives the example of in polychronic cultures like Africa, Asia, Latin America, if you go to a shop or to people trading, you can see people, many people buying from the same seller at the same time. Whereas in a monochronic culture, there is a much stronger tendency for people to have a queue. They line up. So you take one customer at the time. So Hall says in monochronic cultures, people, they perceive time as very tangible. Time is very concrete. Now you can look at me, I have a wristwatch. It's very tangible, it's very concrete. I can watch the time, I can measure it. And I'm very monochronic. Northern Europe, North America, typically very monochronic. And time can be saved and lost and wasted. You have these expressions that you don't have in polychronic cultures. And people are very concerned generally with schedules and doing tasks. I have to finish this task. I have to follow this schedule. I have to be at this meeting on time. Whereas in polychronic cultures, many Asian, many African, many South American cultures, according to Edward T. Hall, people are much more polychronic. Time is less tangible. Time is more fluid. People may not have a watch at all. You take time as it comes. And tasks are not so important. Schedules are not so important. What is important, says Hall, is people, relationships, much more important. And I discussed this with some students from Canada and from Ethiopia. And they said, yeah, this is true of our cultures. The students from Ethiopia said, if we meet somebody in the street, we are obliged, have an obligation to stop and talk to them because they're polychronic. Whereas the Canadian said, well, usually when I meet people in the street in Canada, I don't stop because I don't want to take up their time. Again, we're generalizing, but I think it's very important to have knowledge of these differences because, at least for me, as very monochronic, it makes me now more tolerant towards people who are always late, or people who never hand in their tasks on time, or people who cannot follow the schedule. So I think it's a relevant issue because you will come across it again and again. And I would also like to stress that it's not about one type of culture being better than the other. They have their advantages and disadvantages. It's just that they are different, and this is something we need to keep in mind. Then we're going to say something about values. And also in this area, there have been a lot of different studies to see what kind of values are important to people in different cultures. And I would like to just briefly mention Fons Trompenaars, this Dutch researcher who has done some research in this field, and his fellow countryman, Gert Hofstede. This is Gert Hofstede. He's very famous in intercultural communication circles. Hofstede did a huge study in the 1970s where he got respondents from 117,000 people working in the IBM company across the world in 40 different countries. So he sent out some questionnaires to ask them about what's important for you at work. Is it important to make money, or is it important to have a good relationship with the boss? Is it important to fulfill? Is self-realization important? And such questions. And on the basis of the responses, he found 4 what he calls value dimensions. And he called these dimensions power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism-collectivism, and masculinity-femininity. And I will quickly go through them here, starting with power distance. According to Hofstede, power distance has to do with to what extent do we accept that other people have more power in companies, in schools, in organizations, in the family. And he found that in low power distance cultures, people without power in the system, people low in the hierarchy, will to a larger extent accept and even expect that other people have more power in the system. So people without power will say, yes, I expect my boss to take the decisions. An interesting finding that Hofstede made. Whereas in low power distance cultures, he found that people without power in the system, people at the bottom of the system, they won't expect and accept to the same degree that the boss takes the decisions or people above them takes the decisions. And interestingly, Hofstede, he made a ranking of these different cultures, and he has made follow-up studies later on, and he finds the same pattern. And he finds, for example, that Norway scores quite low on this scale, meaning that people don't like differences. People don't like other people to have more power in the system. And this is something you can see from schools. You can see students calling their teacher by the first name. You can try that in Japan or in France. Hardly possible, I would say. Or you can see people in a company, they expect to be heard, they expect to have their say, they expect the boss to listen to their wishes. And that's not so common if you go to Arab-speaking countries or to African cultures. Again, we're stereotyping, but the interesting thing is that this is what empirical research has shown, and there are many follow-up studies which also point to this. So we'll take them then as tendencies. Now, the next value dimension that Hofstede has is something he calls uncertainty avoidance. To what extent are we comfortable with situations where there is uncertainty and many unknown factors? So Hofstede says that in high uncertainty avoidance cultures, people will feel uncomfortable if they don't have a lot of information before they start working on a task, for example. So people need more structure, people need more information, perhaps they need some rituals to follow before they enter into a new situation with unknown factors. In low uncertainty avoidance cultures, people are much more likely to improvise, to take things on their feet. Norway scores a bit below average on this scale. But what is more interesting, I think, is to look at individual differences. And I can see this with colleagues. I have some colleagues who need a lot of information before they're going to give a lecture, for example. They need to know how many people are becoming, what kind of technical equipment is there, what are the criteria for this and that. They need a lot more information, otherwise they get anxious. Whereas some other colleagues, they will improvise, take it as it comes. In Østfold we have a very nice saying in Fredrikstad. We say "det ordner seg," which is in fact a way of thinking low uncertainty avoidance. Well, okay, we'll be all right. We'll improvise. We'll find solutions. Now, the third value dimension Hofstede has is what he calls individualism-collectivism. And his research shows very clearly that in individualistic cultures, people will to a larger extent define themselves with focus on I rather than we. And self-realization is a very important value. The country which scores highest on this dimension is the United States of America. Norway scores quite high as well. And you may think for yourself, to what extent should we let young people decide their own education? To what extent should we let them decide what to work with? To what extent should they be allowed to decide whom to marry? Well, I think most people in Norway would agree that they should be allowed to decide for themselves, because self-realization is an important value. This is, again, I'm stereotyping, but this is a tendency. And also, there is research which shows it. In collectivist cultures, on the other hand, like parts of Africa, part of Latin America, parts of Asia, people will, to a larger degree, show loyalty to the group, and focus on we is more important than the individual or I. So loyalty into the group is generally more important than self-realization. And there are many stories of, young people who want to decide whom to marry, but they're not allowed to. They want to decide what education to take, but they're not allowed to, because the pressure from the group on the individual is much stronger. And Hofstede goes so far as to say that in collectivistic cultures, people will get protection in exchange for, and I quote, in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. Those are Hofstede's words. And this, of course, affects the way people think about interaction and how to behave. Now, we need to be critical against Hofstede. And again, I think this notion of looking at countries is problematic, because we know that cultures change. But another interesting thing about individualism collectivism is that it has been found in many other studies other than Hofstede, because other studies have also supported this, that this individualism collectivism dimension is a reality in many cultures. Finally, Hofstede talks about masculinity and femininity, and many have criticized his terms here because it really doesn't have anything to do with men and women. It has to do with values. And Hofstede says, in some so-called masculine cultures, the tendency is to focus on competitiveness, on action, on pervasiveness. And Hofstede says, in such cultures, conflicts are more often solved by the use of violence. Whereas in so-called feminine cultures, the tendency is to use a softer approach to competitiveness and conflicts. And equality between the sexes is more important. And as you may guess, Norway scores very low in Hofstede's findings. In his latest studies from 2010, he has 76 different countries and regions, and Norway scores the second lowest. It's the second most feminine culture. Norway's only beaten by Sweden. And some examples to show. This is just random examples from an American prison warden who came to the prison in Halden, which was built in the early 2000s, a very modern prison. And they even have a sound studio. And this American, he was shocked to see, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to punish people? Are you preparing prisoners for a career in music? This is an example of American masculinity, because America scores much higher on masculinity. Which, again, if I may reiterate until it gets boring, doesn't mean that all Americans are masculine or have these masculine values. It just means that there is tendency. Or similarly about Norwegian children's sport, for example. From Sochi, they laughed when they heard about the Norwegian rules for children's sports. Children are not allowed to compete in Norway until the age of, 13? In some cultures, this sounds ridiculous. Another person here from Bulgaria saying that I was shocked when I started to train Norwegian children. Small girls and their parents didn't accept to be corrected, which is something about this idea of having a softer approach as the tendency is in Norway. Okay, I have to speed up because I don't want to go on forever. You're probably tired. But I'll go quickly to Trompenaars' value dimensions. He has a system which is very similar to Hofstede's. And Gerd Hofstede doesn't really like von Trompenaars because he says, Trompenaars has stolen my system. And as you can see here, he is probably right because Trompenaars is using some of the terms which are very similar to Hofstede. This one, communitarianism, collectivism, individualism, is very similar to Hofstede's. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read them in our book if you're interested. But I would like to say something about what he calls universalism and particularism. Trompenaars' research shows that people have different ideas of rules and relationship and what is important. And he uses the following example to illustrate. Now, imagine that you're riding a car with your friend. Your friend is driving, you're in the passenger seat, and your friend is going too fast, he's speeding. And suddenly he runs down a pedestrian, a person walking. And the police comes to the scene and they want you to give a statement. And the question is, would you say that your friend was speeding, or would you say that he was not speeding? The question relates to two values. On the one hand, truth, telling the truth, he was speeding. On the other hand, being loyal to your friend, he was not speeding. Because when Trompenaars asks this question around the world, he finds very different answers. And generally, the tendency is for people in Protestant cultures to say, you have to tell the truth. Whereas in non-Protestant culture, there is a higher tendency for people to say, you must protect your friend. And also it's important to say here that it's not about what you would have done. It is what you think you should do. And that's the value, what you think you should do. I think I should tell the truth. I may protect my friend, but I think I should tell the truth. You can think for yourself what you would have done. And then again, to be critical, there is a problem with this case, as many people have pointed out. What happened to the pedestrian? How badly injured was he? What kind of a country is it? Is it a country where the police is corrupt and people and the police is violent, or is it a country where the police is not corrupt and not violent? So there are some some problems with the case, but still it illustrates, and there is other research also illustrating that this idea of truth versus loyalty is or can be a strong cultural factor. In some cultures, people will prefer to protect their friends or their family rather than telling the truth, whereas in some cultures, it's more important to tell the truth. Yes. So much for, just as a little, an attempt to be funny. Hofstede and Trompenaars talks about neutral versus emotional cultures. In some cultures, he says, it's much more common for people to show emotions, and that is accepted. Such as in the Middle East, for example, there is a tendency for people to use more body language, more emotions. Whereas in some cultures, there is a stronger tendency for people not to show emotions, to be more neutral. And this is then this attempt to be funny from this illustrated book by Nicholas Lund, showing a social guidebook to Norway. Happy, sad, angry, drunk. When we talk to international students about this, there are many international students who tell us that they don't quite understand Norwegian students when they're out having a party, because they can meet them at campus and they're very shy, but when they meet them at the party they can be very, very happy and really talkative and outgoing. And then the international students, they think that, oh, we've made friends now, we're friends. But the day after, the Norwegian students are back to normal. Again, stereotyping, but perhaps there is some truth there. Point number 7 has to do with culture shock or acculturative stress. It has to do with the fact, as research has shown, that sometimes people who move from a culture to another culture for a longer period of time, we're not talking about tourists, we're talking about going for a year or 2 or 3 to another culture. People find it stressful because they find it difficult to interpret the cultural codes. So in such cases, there is research from an American anthropologist, Culver Oberg, showing that sometimes people go through a similar phase, people who go to live in other cultures. And then there is this tendency for people in the first few weeks to feel happy, to feel good, feel like a tourist. But then as time goes by and people start realizing that they don't understand the language, they don't understand the cultural codes, it's difficult to get friends, and they start sort of getting depressed. And some people even get into a shock phase. But the same research also shows that as long as people just hang in there, don't give up, try to learn the language, try to understand the cultural code, learn about the country, learn about the culture, people will start to readjust, and then they will feel better again. This is something we need to keep in mind when we see people, pupils, students coming from other cultures, or parents, that they may feel sad and depressed about having left their home country, but also that there are good chances of them to readjust and to settle down fine in the new culture. Then I'm going to get back to the first story that I told you about my tenant when I was trimming the bushes, and she called me in the evening to ask me if I wanted her to move out. This is something that you can find in many parts of the world. When I once told this story to a group of international students in Oslo, there was a young girl from Indonesia sitting there with her headscarf very quietly, and I asked them about this story of my tenant and why she called me to say, do you want me to move out? I hadn't said anything. I was just trimming my bush. And I asked for an explanation, and she raised her hand and she said, well, it's quite simple. You didn't take her advice. She advised you not to trim that bush in that way, and you just disregarded her advice. You were sending her a signal. And this leads us to Edward T. Hall's theory of high and low context communication. You remember Edward T. Hall, who talks about monochronic and polychronic cultures? He also has this theory of how people communicate in different cultures. And he divides then roughly cultures into high context and low context. In high context cultures, or implicit cultures as he calls them, information is given implicitly, indirectly. It depends on the context. This means that non-verbal communication or cues are important. Body language is important. Information is much more general and fluid. You don't criticize people openly. You just talk generally. You may use the circle communication to beat about the bush, as I would call it, to try to hint at something is wrong here. And also, as Hall says, there is emphasis on oral communication. This is typical of Southeast Asia, and in some African cultures this is also more common. Conversely, in low context cultures, explicit cultures like in North America or in Scandinavia or in Germany, there is much more focus on explicit information. If I want my tenant to move out, I'm going to tell her to move out. I'm going to say, look, you haven't been paying your rent for the last 2 years. You have to move out now. Hall says also there is information should be specific. Be clear. You haven't paid the rent, you have to move out. I'm not going to trim bushes to send you signals. Information is generally detailed and fragmented, and according to Hall, emphasis on written communication. As you can understand now, we're simplifying this a little, but the general idea is that information in low context cultures is much more direct and explicit. Now, again, and this is now where we have to be critical, we have to be careful, because Hall and Hofstede and some of these other researchers, they want to focus on national cultures. Magne Djupedal and myself, we do not want to focus on national cultures, but still, just to give you an idea what Hall says about this. Hall says there is a tendency for people in Japan, Arabic cultures, Greek culture to be more high context, whereas Germany, Scandinavia, Americans are more low context, high context, low context. But this is not so important for us. The important thing for us is that you, as an individual, try to think for yourself, how direct am I in my communication? Because I've had Norwegian, remember my tenant, an ethnic Norwegian woman, she was very high context, communicating in this way. And the literature is full of similar stories. There is this story from a book on intercultural communication of people being invited to somebody for tea, somebody that they don't know very well, and the host gives them lukewarm tea, tepid tea which is not hot or cold, it's lukewarm. What does that mean? Does that mean that there is something wrong with the kettle? Or does it mean that there is something wrong with you? Well, in this case, it means that the host was trying to send a signal to the guest. Something is wrong here. I'm serving you lukewarm tea. This is then an example of high context communication. You're using non-verbal cues to send a message. If you come to a low context culture, or with low context individuals rather, I would say, people are much more direct. I don't like what you've written here, or you should keep your mouth shut. People are very direct. I'm sure that you've all met these people. And I've had colleagues who are very, very direct, saying just straight out what they mean, and they just want to be honest. But the problem is, when they talk to colleagues who are high context, they can be very offended. I've had colleagues, high context colleagues, coming to my office saying, I never want to speak to that woman again because she's so critical and so direct. And the critical and direct colleague says to me, I just want to be honest. I just want to be, to give good advice here. But the problem is that if the high context person gets offended, he or she may not want to communicate with this low context person. And this is something we need to think about. Not whether Germans are low context or Japanese are high context. That's not important for me. The important thing for me is that you try to find out where are you on this scale, and also be aware of the fact that even if people are very direct, they may not mean to offend you. Even if people tell you that they want to do as you say, or I agree with you, they may not agree with you. My last point on this, in this presentation, relates to the same thing. And I want to end with a little story again. The story is of a student from an African country that I had in an oral exam once, when I first started out as a young teacher and I didn't know anything about intercultural communication. And the student, this African student, he was in his 40s, he was older than the other students, and he came to the exam and I started asking questions. And then when I came to a book that was on the syllabus, there was this novel that they were going to read, and I asked him, tell us about this novel. And it fairly quickly became obvious to me that he hadn't read the novel. And then he said, oh, I haven't read the novel. And I said, okay, fine, just go to the next point. But then the external examiner, censor, who was sitting beside me, she just blurted out, why didn't you read the book? And suddenly everything went into the buffers for this student. And he started stammering and he started sweating and he said, well, the book was not on the list, he said. And I just had to ask, I'm sorry, what did you say now? And he repeated the point, saying, the book is not on the list. And I just couldn't understand what he was talking about. So I had to say, well, are you saying that the book is not on the syllabus? And he said, yes, the book is not on the syllabus. And I just thought, is he very stupid, or does he think that I'm very stupid? I wouldn't ask questions from a book which is not on the syllabus. I'm not allowed to do that. I can't do that. But I said to him, I'm sorry, but the book is on the syllabus. And then he said, well, it's not that list, it's another list. And I asked him, okay, which list are you referring to now? And he couldn't explain, he was just stammering. So I said to him, okay, are you saying that the book is not on the term schedule? And he said to me, yes. I really thought this was really absurd because, of course, I can't ask questions from something which is not on the term schedule. So I said to him, the book is on the term schedule. So all in all, the situation was very uncomfortable. So we just had to go on. And I really didn't understand anything of what was going on. You may understand what was going on. Because this is, again, a very, very common aspect of intercultural communication, a very common mechanism frequently observed in intercultural encounters. And what I'm talking about here is loss of face. And loss of face can be understood as the feeling of having made a mistake in public, or the feeling of losing your honor or integrity when you have to admit a mistake, or somebody has found out that you've done something wrong. And this is something we can all feel in all cultures. But studies show that there are different ways of relating to this loss of face in different cultures. And some scholars relate it to the difference between shame cultures and guilt cultures. That in Protestant cultures there is a tendency for people to feel guilt when they've made something wrong, and they have to admit the mistake before they can be accepted. This is a bit like Protestant religion and how Protestant religion has affected culture, according to some scholars. That in Protestant religion, if you make a mistake, if you sin, you have to admit your sin before you can get redemption, before you can get acceptance. And so some people say that in Protestant cultures, this is a very strong thing. Whereas in shame cultures, the point is more like you're feeling shame about something because you feel that you have been made a fool of in public. So you have to find an excuse, or you have to find a way of making that shame go away. So in such cultures, you do not have this idea of admitting a mistake for being accepted to the same degree. And also, there is this idea of making sure that others do not lose face. So in order to not make it uncomfortable for other people, you don't ask critical questions. you leave things as they are. So if you take the examples I gave you with me at the oral exam and this student who, in my opinion, he accused me of putting a book on the syllabus which shouldn't be on the syllabus. But in this case, I wasn't very interculturally competent. I was quite interculturally incompetent, because I should have realized that he was trying to save face. He was trying to make this shame go away by making an excuse in my interpretation. So what I should have done was to say, of course, okay, let's just move on. Let's forget about the list. Let's forget about the syllabus and the term schedule. Let's just go on. He knew that he had made a mistake. I knew that he had made a mistake. So there was no need for me to keep on asking these questions. But from a Protestant culture, there is something, that's sometimes how things are done. But you should be aware of this aspect, because it frequently hits teachers in school. I've talked to teachers who tell me of children in primary school. When the teacher asks, "Have you understood this?" then sometimes the pupil won't admit that he or she doesn't know. Perhaps coming from a shame culture, a loss of face is more important. So the pupil would say, "Yes, I understand." And when you get to the test, it turns out that the pupil hasn't understood anything. And this may be explained in terms of loss of face. Okay, this was a very long lecture. I'm sorry for keeping it so long, but I had so much that I wanted to share with you. You can read more about this in the book. But the point about becoming intercultural communication, or interculturally competent, in our view, is knowledge, reflection, and attitude. And also, as this cartoon shows, the ability to change perspective. Thank you very much.